Welcome back to Proxim, everybody. And today we're going to be doing a video not on your standard typical 2,000 point or 1,500 point games, but we're going to be looking a little bit smaller at 1,000 point games or less. And we're going to be specifically going into how to play Craftworld Eldar on a smaller board. As most of you know, when you do play 1,000 point games or less, you're playing on a board that is a little bit smaller than your standard table. And while it might not seem like it in a lot of ways, there are unique challenges and different strategies that you can utilize on a smaller board to gain a greater advantage in these games. So we're going to talk about them a little bit. I actually think that Eldar have a couple of things that they can do on smaller boards to make it even harder for enemy units to actually succeed in breaking up your strategy and your game plan. So yeah, let's dive right into it. So a quick overview of this video, we're going to be looking at playing on a smaller board, 1K games or less, and we're going to be looking at the dimensions of the board itself. We're going to be talking about the advantages and disadvantages of playing on a smaller board, and lastly, some tips and tricks when playing on this smaller board. So a lot of you might be thinking right now, well, it's mostly the same, right? I mean, there's only a slight difference between a board of 2,000 point games and a board of 1,000 point games. And while you would mostly be correct, there are some things that you do have to look out for, and there are some minor changes in how you're going to play that said game because of the shorter distance lengthwise on the table. So here's an example of one of the incursion missions that you might see. So normally we would play strike force missions. Typically when you're playing anything above 1,000 points, you're playing a strike force game, which has a regular board. But if you're playing a smaller game, 1,000 points or less, you're actually going to be playing on a board that is 4 by 4 feet. And normally it's 4 by 5 feet. And as some of you veterans might have remembered from past editions, this is actually even smaller than it was before. Before, you would typically play on a 4 by 6 board. That was basically the standard board size for 5th edition and so forth. But GW decided that they were going to decrease the size of the boards. And honestly, it didn't make that much of a difference. Honestly, I felt like for Eldar, it was actually a little bit better because it made corner camping with long-range armies a little bit harder and things like that. And I think it was a healthy thing for the game. But getting back on topic here, 4x4 is your standard smaller game size. So this means, again, there's going to be less room on the edges when playing horizontally or diagonally. So if you are playing a horizontal game where you have a 12-inch deployment on the long board edge, you're going to have a shorter distance on the sides by about 6 inches on each side, which may not seem like a lot, but this could make a huge difference, especially with some of the stuff we're going to talk about in this video. And when you're playing diagonally, again, this is where having a short end of the board, I should say, on the sides of the board can make a big difference. So in this example, this is from one of the missions in the incursion selection in Nephilim. And as you can see, the board space on the sides is a little bit smaller. And that's going to give you and your opponent a little bit less room on the flanks to, deploy troops and things like that. Which normally is not that big of an issue because, again, we're playing small games, so you have less forces to work with. It makes sense that you would have, of course, less room to play with. Now, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of playing on a smaller board? So this may seem a little bit harder to grasp at first or harder to recognize, but some of the advantages include board control. So board control is a bit easier in smaller games as your denial unit's threat range counts for more. So that unit of D cannons or that unit of Howling Banshees that you have in the Wave Serpent are going to have a greater impact on the game because your opponent has less room to work with and therefore can't as easily stay out of those threat ranges in your denial bubbles. So that's one of the things that's a little bit easier on a smaller board. Also, units coming from strategic reserve have less distance to cover to engage their targets. And again, if your opponent is playing with 6 inches less on each board side, no matter if they're playing diagonally or horizontally. Again, if you're playing vertically, this does not matter whatsoever pretty much in a lot of ways. But if you're playing, again, either horizontally or diagonally, your strategic reserve units are going to have an easier time getting into contact with the units that they want to get into contact with. So you're striking scorpions, your guardians, or whatever unit you put in strategic reserve, you're going to have a little bit of an easier time getting them to engage with the proper targets. And then there are some disadvantages as well that you have to be aware of. So first of all, if you have fast flanking units, your fast flanking units like Vipers, Warp Spiders, and stuff like that, they're going to have a little bit less room to maneuver. So Eldar are generally really fast. They have really great redeployment and hit and run type abilities. So we don't suffer as much from that. But again, because we have so many fast units that really rely on being hidden, we're going to have about 6 inches less on each board side to maneuver into a good spot to basically hide from enemy fire. So this can also put you at a bit of a disadvantage. And long-range components have less space to outrange enemies. So this is particularly important when thinking about things like fire prisms, which are going to primarily be deployed in the corners of the board behind obscuring terrain so the enemy can't see them. And they're going to pop out and use their greater range to outrange long targets, basically targets across the board that either pop out to do damage to you or sit on objectives that are kind of out of range of most of your shorter range units, right? That's going to be a little bit harder to do with things like fire prisms because they're going to have less distance between them and their targets. So they really have to rely more on obscuring terrain more than anything else. And they can't really rely on outranging the enemy firepower. Let's say they have 36-inch range weapons that are in their deployment zone. Fire prisms are not really going to be able to hide from that as easily as on a bigger board if they're deployed in the corners or edges of the board. So, what are some tips and tricks when playing on a smaller board? So, first of all, the use of denial tactics versus aggressive tactics is a very important distinction in these types of games. Aggressive tactics in smaller games, if they go wrong, can really go wrong. Let's just say that. You have less units to work with typically, and typically on a smaller board, there's some issues which we'll talk about in just a second, at least when it comes to aggressive style Alpha Strike tactics. Also, make use of strategic reserve. Strategic reserve is very powerful in smaller games because, again, your opponent is not going to have as much room on the flanks to maneuver and hide their forces or screen your forces out. So make use of strategic reserve. It's a really powerful tool in these small games. And lastly, pay extra attention to enemy reserves and make sure to prepare screens for them because remember, the enemy can do the same thing right back to you. And trust me, nothing is worse than having your D cannons a little bit too close to the flank without the proper screening units and the enemy army just charging a unit of Vanguard veterans right into your D cannons. That's never a good thing. Trust me. You do not want that to happen. So make sure that you do screen them properly so that they're not able to do that. So when I'm talking about using denial tactics versus aggressive tactics, a lot of players might say, well, aggressive tactics can really work well in smaller games because the enemy force has less to use. The enemy force has less kind of, things like screening units to stop your aggressive units. But again, remember that cuts both ways. Not only are they lacking maybe some screens, easy and cheap screens for their forces, but you could also be lacking the punching power to really truly deliver a final blow. And just to give you an example, Eldar work very much like a clock, right? Every little cog, every little gear must be operating at full capacity. If one little thing falls, then a lot of it goes down and your clock is just not going to work, right? So you really need to make sure that you have the proper resources necessary to take out those key targets. And in smaller point games, this can be a little bit harder to fit in. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but again, it's going to be harder to fit in. Also, being aggressive can overexpose you and leave yourself open to counterattacks, especially, again, if you don't have the offensive tools to deal with their entire force, 1. And 2, if you are playing on a smaller board, remember, enemies are going to tend to be a little bit closer together and thus have stronger defenses. They're going to be able to use terrain a little bit better because they have less forces to actually fit in terrain. So if you're trying to assault an enemy position on an Alpha Strike turn 1, you might come across a whole army, 1,000 points worth of units, clustered within a few pieces of terrain. And that's not going to go well for you. Even Eldar can't take out 1,000 points of heavily entrenched Space Marines or, Plague Marines or whatever you're going up against, Eldar cannot take out that much stuff, especially if they're all heavily entrenched within terrain and they're tougher units, Things like Thousand Suns, for example, which I just recently did a video on, and I think I missed a couple of things with their Terminators that honestly my opponent didn't really take into consideration, and I didn't have to personally face down, but, there are armies out there that will bring very tough units against you in 1,000 points that you're just not going to be able to deal with in a single turn like that. So things like Thousand Suns, if your opponent is a little bit on the cheekier side and brings 10 Terminators in a 1,000-point game, a big blob like that, you're probably not going to be able to deal with that in one turn. That's more of a multiple turn kind of thing that you're going to need to handle. So beware of that as well. And that is really why denial tactics and defensive tactics in these types of games are just much more effective in general. Because if you use your forces to deny board space on an even smaller battlefield, that can be extremely strong and frustrating for your enemy. So let me give you an example, that 10 Terminator example. If I'm aggressive with that unit, I'm probably not going to be able to crack it, and thus the enemy is going to be able to retaliate and crack our units because they're very fragile. But if I hide my unit of D cannons behind a good piece of terrain that's covering most of the objectives on the board because of the smaller board space, those Terminators really aren't going to be able to take the middle of the board without taking huge amounts of casualties. Those D cannons can really rip them apart. Just to give you an example, against a unit of 10, you're basically going to be rolling 9 dice, and probably if you're running Uthway or using the reroll 1 stratagem for Guardians, you're going to be hitting a fairly significant amount of those, and you're going to be basically wounding all of them because, again, Strength 12, Toughness 4. You're going to be wounding on 2s. And they're going to be taking mortal wounds on 6s, and they're going to be dying on 5+. So that's extremely insane, right? So you can take out a fairly significant amount of those guys if they come into your range. And that's why using denial tactics can be a lot more powerful than being super aggressive with your opponent. So again, different units also. It doesn't just have to be D cannons. It can be Howling Banshees as well, right? You can use Howling Banshees to basically force enemies to go onto objectives to try to capture them and then take them out with the Howling Banshees. Once they're out in the open and possibly isolated, right? They can't take the whole board. They can't take all of the objectives and support all the objectives at the same time. You can slowly pick apart your opponent. So you don't just have to go for that alpha strike. You can play more defensively, and that can actually bring you more damage over the long course of the game than it would in the short course of the game in a couple of the first turns, right? So using denial tactics versus aggressive tactics is, in my opinion, much stronger, especially in smaller point games like this. Also, make sure that you can use strategic reserve when applicable. So it's not going to work for every army. Some armies just don't use strategic reserve that well, depending on what your build is. But even though strategic reserve does cost a little bit of command points, it can be extremely effective to force your opponent to, again, keep units behind to screen. So you may be wondering, what do you mean keep units behind a screen? So if your opponent is running 1,000 points worth of models, and let's say you're facing an army that doesn't really have a lot of cheap, accessible units like Imperial Guardsmen and stuff like that, they're going to have to waste a significant amount of their army screening out your strategic reserves so that your strategic reserves can't get into key enemy elements. So, for example, if you're going against something like Lees of Votan, they're going to have to use a pretty expensive unit of Hearthkin warriors to stop you. And yeah, some armies don't need to do this, right? I mean, I know that certain Chaos armies don't really have much in the way of, a problem when it comes to cheap units. They could just throw in a unit of 50 or 10 cultists, which are 50 points, right? And they, don't lose much for that. But again, those are 10 cultists that are being used to screen stuff and not being on their primary objective. So again, they're going to have to waste a key unit of something like Thousand Suns, Rubric Marines, or Death Guard to be able to actually keep that objective, right? So there's ways of using strategic reserve to waste your opponent's resources so that they have to, again, split up their units and stuff like that. And this can make it just even easier to pick enemies apart when they're separated like that without support. And lastly, just as they have to watch out for your reserves, make sure to pay attention to the enemy reserves and make sure to have proper screens for them. So just like your own reserves, the enemy can do the same thing to you. So make sure you have units that can respond accordingly to prevent or forewarned enemy reserves from existence. So having a unit of D cannons ready to block a unit of Vanguard veterans from coming in strategic reserve, or having a unit of guided shroud runners that can also do a similar role and also, deny their charge ability is a very strong tactic. So let me just give you an example of something that happened in a previous game where I was playing in 1,000 points. I had a unit of 5 shroud runners on a flank. I didn't really have a screening tool available to me because my rangers had died. So when he came in, he was actually expecting that he was going to be able to just go into my shroud runners and rip them apart in close combat. But by using the forewarn stratagem and Overwatch, I was actually able to take the unit down to a significant amount, in which he only had 1 unit left to charge. And then luckily I had quite a few command points that turn, and I was able to actually use the wire weave grenades, which finished off the last model in the unit. Now this won't always happen. Again, this was partially because I was rolling pretty hot. Normally scatter lasers aren't going to kill an entire unit of Space Marines. But I have to say, if you do have guide on them or something like that, it can really be hard for your opponent to actually get into combat with you. So again, use units to screen yourself out and protect your more vulnerable elements of your army. And even if you don't have something like a large unit of shroud runners, D cannons work very well as a forewarned target, even though they don't do as much mass damage to infantry. They can still do a really significant amount. You would be surprised. 3 D cannons firing at something like a unit of 5 Vanguard veterans coming from reserve or whatever it is still going to get about 6 attacks on them. Maybe you get about 4 hits. More if you obviously use one of the stratagems, if you're playing Uthway, Black Guardians, or, the one that allows you to reroll ones to hit for Guardians is really good. And you get about 4 hits maybe, and you kill about 3 of them. That's really significant. That's going to basically blunt the charge of that unit and make it pretty difficult for them to actually kill your D cannons. So in essence, you can really neutralize a threat before it becomes that big of a deal. And again, as Eldar, we have a few ways to get out of those situations as well, right? We have a stratagem that allows us to fall back and then shoot, right, for a command point and so forth. So those situations can be gotten out of as long as you plan accordingly, have the right screens available, and if you don't have the right screens available, have the right command points and resources to allocate to be able to get rid of those units effectively. So in conclusion, I think that if you are playing on a smaller board, there may not seem like much of a difference at first, but there are a few key elements which set it apart, making denial tactics much more powerful. So again, I know that you guys have probably heard this a lot by now, but Craftworld Eldar, especially in Nephilim, is a very good faction at denying enemy reinforcements from coming in the first place, and also really good at denying enemy objectives. Because of our ability to basically play hide and seek with enemy units, and once those units do come out onto objectives to capture them, we have a very easy time being able to kill those units piece by piece. So defensive tactics are something that is very strong with Eldar and even more so on a smaller board. So my general advice would be for those of you wondering how to play on a smaller board, like, in 1,000-point games and less, is just to simply play more defensively and use denial tactics and strategic reserve to your advantage in those games. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. I know it was kind of shorter than the previous videos, but I didn't think this was going to go too long. I hope to make another video later this week covering the Astra Militarum and what I think about the new codex and my first impressions of it. And then later on, we're going to do some videos covering other factions as well, trying to get those wrapped up before January. In which time, hopefully we'll have a lot of little small buffs here and there to help with the internal balance of the codex. But we'll see. GW sometimes just doesn't do anything for Eldar, so we'll see what they do with that. All right, everybody, peace out, have a good one, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Later, everybody.